Initially, Psyched Out was supposed to be a direct sequel to my previous fan game, Crash Bandicoot Apocalypse. We started development almost immediately after the previous one and thought that it would be cool if the story picked off where it left off. So, Cortex and Uka Uka were sucked off into another dimension, and that would be the starting point of the new story. The original script was only half complete, mostly being summaries of what was going to happen, but we did write dialogue for several chapters. The story began with Cortex finding himself trapped inside Coco's brain, or Coco's mindscape, with Uka Uka, since that's where they happen to end up at after Apocalypse, by random chance. So Cortex takes over the place and causes Coco to become evil instead of her being brainwashed by Entrance. Speaking of which, Entrance was not the original villain we were planning for the game. We actually were planning to bring back the evil twins from Crash Twinsanity, and they would be behind the mind control mess. But they would also attempt to cause chaos in the world by combining different dimensions together, bringing all sorts of alien creatures and structures into the regular world. The zippers were going to be the main collectible from the beginning, but the twins were the ones hiding them inside these different mindscapes. And the rest of the story would go mostly like in the final game, so Crash and Cortex travel the islands and visit different mindscapes to find these zippers, but some levels and bosses would be different. However, after working on the script for a while, we realized that it was too messy and that the premise was too much of a stretch to be believable. The twins clearly died in Twinsanity, and they weren't all that interesting villains to further utilize, so we decided to rewrite the entire script, keeping some elements from it, but coming up with new villains and removing some characters and locations.
I remember pitching the plot as Apocalypse wasn't even finished yet. I was like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if shit went down right after Cortex got sucked into Coco's brain? This is where Coco Catastrophe came from, actually. Originally, Cortex was going to be responsible for her head being messed up as it is, but I've yet to see anyone question why it's in disarray in the final game, so evidently it worked there too. The idea of many levels taking place inside people's brains were inspired by two things. One being Gonna Coco itself, how neat it would be if that concept carried over to other villains and characters, and two being Psychonauts of all games. The levels aren't as deep or in depth as in Psychonauts, but the game puts off a wonderful atmosphere for its levels, and I thought it would be fun to try and go for something more oppressive for this game. The original script for the game I personally found to be way too try-hard. From the beginning we wanted to put more emphasis in the plot than in any of other Hypergolems games, but this led to the first draft being incredibly long-winded with way too many forced jokes and quips crammed into the script. Ultimately, in the final script, we opted to play the plot more straight, with humor more tongue-in-cheek rather than flat-out zany like the Radical games. It took forever to get to the point as well. In the final game, I broke Hypergolem's back, writing for over 30 cutscenes. I hate to imagine how many cutscenes the original script would have had, with all the mental gymnastics we'd have to jump through just to justify having the evil twins be the primary villains. Even the end game was confusing. I wanted Cortex to betray everyone near the end of the game since the very beginning, but the way the plot was shaping made it incredibly confusing. Cortex would hold everybody up inside of his brain to trap them inside and take the last zipper for himself, but this was before the last boss where he was needed for gameplay purposes, which was also planned from the beginning, so he would make another truce with them and still betray them near the end. Much more hassle than he holds a gun to their faces once the bad guy is defeated.
There were several characters in the original script besides the twins that didn't make it into the final version. For example, Crash and Cortex were supposed to meet the Komodo brothers in Skull Rock, and they would have to escape from them in a minecart race, a level which you may have seen in the video where I showcased some alpha and beta content. And after this level, the two would find themselves in Engine's secret lair, where they would have to fight him and some funny scenes would ensue. And in this version of the story, Engine would be the one to provide Cortex with the Midomatic device. And some characters did make it into the final script, but originally had a different role. For example, Entrance was in the script, but he acted as the twins' minion instead of the main villain. He was still a boss though, but we also had Nina Cortex, and she was supposed to be a boss as well, instead of just a minigame host in the evil school hub. And we also had several enemy concepts that we didn't end up using, like a moving crate enemy, a clown enemy, and a spider enemy.
Yeah, let me explain the clown enemy since the story is mildly interesting. Originally, Cortex's mind was going to be this weird kind of science circus in reference to Cortex's backstory in the first game's production bible of growing up as a circus clown. This was all talk though, and the clown enemy was all that was conceptualized. I went for something more familiar to the character when the time came to flesh out the stage's theming. I wanted the last level in the game to be more foreboding than funny, and to follow up on Cortex's lamenting in the beginning cutscene. This is why all the enemies in the level are screwed up versions of Crash, as a way to show that Cortex's biggest mistake is always at the forefront of his psyche. Also, Psychonauts already had a circus stage for its final level, and I was already ripping on it hard enough as it is.
Crash and Cortex were originally supposed to visit several old and new locations that didn't make it into the final version of the game. There was the aforementioned Skull Rock with the Komodo brothers, but we also had such levels as a swamp, a haunted house, and Cortex's castle. And Cortex's castle was meant to house a spaceship that would take Crash, Coco, and Cortex into the heart of the galaxy, where the evil twins were residing in this overtaken ancient temple that was supposed to be quite similar to the one you see in Crash Bash and Crash the Wrath of Cortex. And in order to get to this temple, they would have also had to go through several space-themed levels.
One could argue we got Cortex Castle in the final game, albeit much more distorted. The Haunted House level ended up becoming Pinstripe's Mansion since it was much more thematically appropriate to the series. Ghouls and Ghosts and Crash is a very weird mix to me.
The gameplay was always going to be heavily inspired from Twinsanity, having Crash and Cortex work together to pass through different hazards and obstacles. But there were a few gimmicks that never left the drawing board, and one of them was Crash using Cortex in a zip railing segment, similar to Twinsanity in the Humulus Gate levels. And another one we had was Crash spinning Cortex into an electric current, activating a machine somewhere nearby. But this idea was carried over to the Coco Mindscape level with the teddy bears. Originally, the progression of the game was to be less linear and more open-ended, in the sense that you would visit the hub worlds every time you completed a level. So they acted more like the traditional warp rooms from Crash 2 and 3. So if you had not defeated the boss yet, and you had not destroyed all the mind control towers, the NPC characters in the hubs would sometimes, be still mind controlled by Entrance, and you would not be able to play the minigame. And they would also have different dialogue to reflect the story progress. But in the end I decided against this format because I felt that the story was big enough to have a stable flow, and it would make more sense to move from one level to the next, instead of constantly visiting the hub world.
I only remember tossing Cortex into equipment being an actual consideration, since I only quickly doodled the zip rail thing as a funny idea rather than an actual concept. Then again, Grub was originally just supposed to be a regular enemy, so who knows.
Hi, my name is Ben, also known as B13CW, and I created the soundtrack for Crash Bandicoot Psyched Out. As some of you might already know, I run a YouTube channel by the same name where I upload most of my work. I'm completely unmonetized. I do this just as a hobby. I found that a lot of people tend to think that I do this to make a quick buck on the internet, which is understandable, but it's not actually the case. I'm actually just bad at what I do. I'm completely self-taught. Everything that I've done, I've just figured out in my own free time. But I'm proud of the work that I've done, and it's something that I enjoy quite a bit. So prior to my work on Psyched Out, I had actually done the soundtrack for Hypergolem's fan game, Crash Bandicoot Apocalypse. But for that game, I didn't do a lot of original tracks. I borrowed heavily from older games. I didn't necessarily push myself to do something new. I was in school at the time, and I didn't have a lot of free time, but this was a project unlike anything I had done before, and I thought, why not? It's a good learning experience. But for Psyched Out, I figured that it was time to step things up a bit more. So for this game, I pushed myself to do more original tracks and try to compose things completely on my own, which is something that I hadn't done much of before. I also had more interaction with Gray and Hypergolem. I would send them rough drafts of things that I had, and we would make tweaks accordingly, even throw out entire songs if they weren't working and start over again. So I learned quite a bit in the process for creating things. I actually still did borrow quite a bit from past games because I'm not a composer by trade and I needed something to use as a starting off point. But when I did so, I tried to make sure that I was reinterpreting it in interesting ways or using it in places that it hadn't been used before. You'll still probably notice that most of these tracks are just overt remixes of existing tracks, but in equal measure, you might notice that some of these are remixes or reinterpretations that you might not have noticed at first. So I suppose that my challenge to you is that for anyone who's interested, maybe try taking a closer listen to some of the tracks and see if you can spot something that maybe people haven't quite found yet. I will give you a hint. I have used quite a bit from the Game Boy version of Crash Nitro Kart, so if you're going to start looking, start there. But in the end, I learned quite a lot from this, and I had a lot of fun. It took over a year to put the whole thing together, so this was a project that I was on for quite some time. So I hope that you all had fun playing the game, and I hope that you had fun listening to the soundtrack, and I hope to maybe do more things like this in the future.
Crash Bandicoot Psyched Out was definitely our most ambitious project ever, and we are very proud to have finished it. There were times when I wasn't sure if things were going to work out or if the game was going to be worth the trouble, but in the end it was you fans who pushed us to try harder and finish what we started. And we are so grateful for your support over the years, and it would not have been possible without you guys. Thank you so much.